Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be discussing the final episode of Disclaimer, this mini-series here on Apple TV Plus, based on a novel, very faithfully adapted here, and I will discuss the differences between the novel and the series as well here in the finale, where there is most divergence, if you're curious, Sona. Very creatively named Roman numeral 7, 7 episodes. Upcoming on the podcast for everybody out there, I'm going to watch Heretic this weekend. So, any interest in that? Have you seen the trailer for this?
I haven't, but I also feel like I've just heard about it kind of in the ether, but I don't really know anything. Like, I don't know what it's about or who's in it.
It's really interesting idea. I have avoided the trailers for this intentionally. It played all the film festivals in the fall, got excellent reviews. It's from the duo that wrote the original Quiet Place movie, who now are writing and producing and directing, I should say, their own films. And it stars Hugh Grant. And basically what it is these Mormon girls, these two girls show up at his house and they are on their, I forget what they call it, when they proselytize. They have their summer, their year where they travel the country and they basically do their works as part of their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up at a house with Hugh Grant, who is this very friendly but a little odd person. And basically, over the course of the night, he starts to challenge their beliefs. And it becomes really, the film, from what I know, mostly takes place in a few rooms within the house. But it starts to feel at some point where, is he creepy? Is he earnestly challenging their beliefs? Is he more demonic figure, maybe this is some kind of test, and is there something supernatural going on? So it's a very kind of ambiguous mood the film has, but even people who don't really buy in, some people think like this is a very interesting and challenging and full of ideas and suspense. And some reviews I've read are that it doesn't quite achieve what it's trying to do, but unanimously, everybody says Hugh Grant is having such a blast with this role. So I think that it might be like a horror movie, the rare horror movie where a performer gets an Academy Award nomination.
Interesting.
And I very much have enjoyed this cantankerous version of Hugh Grant that we're getting late in his career. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, it sounds like a more serious version, but the way you're describing it, it's like the Harrison Ford character in Shrinking.
Yes, but maybe with more deadly consequences.
Right. Yes.
Essentially,
Understood.
I mean, maybe the payoff here is that there's nothing supernatural going on. I don't know. I honestly haven't.
He's just a cranky old man.
Just a cranky old guy who likes to troll these young girls. I probably know less than the average viewer because I avoid trailers now. I've seen so many trailers just in the past year that I do actually actively watch because I plan to cover something on the show. So I feel like I need to be a little more up to speed on what I'm going to be talking about. And that when I go see the movies, I'm like, this trailer gave away the end of the film. I'm like, I just don't watch trailers anymore. I can't. They just ruin too many things for me. So yeah, I'm going in with very little information and very much looking forward to that. And hopefully I enjoyed as much as most people seem to be. Also, we'll be discussing The Penguin. Has Joel kept up with The Penguin, by the way?
He actually just caught up on, he must have watched at least 3 episodes in a row yesterday, and he loves it. He says it's amazing. He says, I should be watching it. He said to me, you should be covering this on the podcast. I said, I think it probably is being covered on the podcast. It's just not my genre.
We haven't actually covered it officially on the podcast, but I've mentioned it in other conversations, but we're definitely coming to the finale. And I would agree with that as well. Celia, by the way, my sister, who I just did a review episode because she had seen Anora, and we discussed Anora in detail just in the previous episode. She's been watching Penguin, and right around the time you asked me if I was watching it, or Joel had asked, it was very much like, okay, it's like a gangster show, kind of like a Godfather type, in that genre, but with Batman, but Batman's not in it, which just basically makes it a gangster film in the context of Gotham City in this fictional world. And I watched the first 2 or 3 episodes, and I was like, I liked it, but I wasn't up to date on it. I was like, whatever. And Celia had told me, oh, if you're behind on it, you should definitely catch up. And like Joel was saying, or he probably had this experience of binging it. I did the same thing where I caught up, and it did turn into a different type of show, and a type of show that I think you would like. So
really?
I do think that you should check it out because it's basically kind of lures you in with representing itself as being in one genre, and then it is still a gangster series, but it is more complex in what it's actually exploring. And and you don't have to know anything. This is another thing that I think is a big selling point here. You do not know anything about Batman lore at all to watch this show. That has really nothing to do with Batman.
He also said, I'll add, I might butcher her name here, Kristen Milotti.
Kristen, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He said she's amazing here, and he never would have guessed from seeing her in How I
Yes.
Met Your Mother that she
Mm-hmm.
had all of this in her.
Yes, that's exactly part of the reason you will probably enjoy this. She becomes as large a figure, especially after episode 4, maybe more a central figure in the story beyond that point. And I mean, in a weird sort of way, it speaks to the politics of this time as well, because you end up having her basically reaching out to the criminals of Gotham to unify under her. And Penguin is simultaneously messaging, but they're both populist in a way. She's saying, like, you've never had power before, and I will share my power with you. And then meanwhile, he is also like a populist who's saying, screw the system. You need to be under me. And like, like we're going to show them. We're going to show them all, even though he's like incredibly selfish and self-centered person. But still, that message resonates with these people. But of course, they're both terrible people whose goal is to enslave people to this new drug, which is the underlying storyline there. But then just anyway, the complexity of that metaphor as you go forward and you see both of these characters as sympathetic characters who are doing absolutely terrible things, it's very interesting. And yes, I think it's an interesting watch. And it's short. It's not a very long series. And Colin Farrell has been saying that he wears like 3 or 4 hours of prosthetic makeup every single day. And he literally was saying, I'm never going to do this again. So all these people are saying like, oh, this show's such a big hit. We're going to have another Penguin, or we'll have a Penguin movie, or he'll be like the villain in the next Batman movie. And and he's Colin Farrell saying like, I'm not doing this anymore. So it is very possible that, the Penguin could die at the end of this Penguin series, which would be another surprise result. And then just 1 week after that, by the way, that's wrapping up this week. We'll discuss it here on a podcast in greater detail. And the following week, the beginning of the Dune Prophecy, another very short series. I think it's only 5 episodes. So another reason I will be watching that is, I mean, I really like the Dune movies. I don't know if this is going to work as a TV series. It's also a prequel, like 1,000 years previous. So I'm not sure I'm that vested in that, 1,000 years before the storyline where, as popular viewers invested in. But I mean, it's only 5 episodes. So I'll check that out. And Silo's coming back in tandem. I'll probably be covering it here as well. I wasn't a huge fan of the first season of Silo, but it leaves off in a very interesting point where the book actually, to me, gets interesting. So I am curious to see what they do in another season. I felt the story was very dragged out. They're doing 2 seasons to cover 1 book. I think it's too long. Honestly, whether I pursue this series any further really depends on my reaction to these early episodes. So we'll see. And I'll have my opinion of that in about another week or 2. We'll also be talking about a bunch of spy shows that are coming out, Sona. We have Day of the Jackal, which has some very strong early reviews. 5 episodes of that premiere next week. And I sent you a trailer for this later in the month. I'm very much looking forward to this. The Michael Fassbender series called The Agency, which is based on a French series called The Bureau. If anyone's curious about that, it's available on Hulu. I've not seen any of that, but once again, very highly respected. And I'm a big fan of Michael Fassbender. I thought this trailer was thrilling and one of the best trailers I've seen recently. So very excited to see this show. And there's also a Keira Knightley spy series premiering the following week on Netflix. So maybe December, we'll just be talking about spy shows. And you can, of course, sample as much of that as you'd like.
I love them, even though sometimes I find it hard to understand them.
And one more thing I want to call out. There's so many things premiering before Thanksgiving or before the end of the month, including Gladiator 2 is coming out. Moana 2 is coming out. Heretic is coming out. So I'm not even talking about the movies. I'm talking about so many things on TV. One more thing, Sona, that we covered here in the podcast is based on a true story, which I didn't even know they had finished season 2 of this thing. And it's coming out. And it's coming out as a binge in just a couple of weeks. So that's another thing, yet another thing to watch. And anybody who's catching up on that show, we do have an episode where Sona and I discussed the entire series when it premiered, I guess a year ago, maybe even more than a year ago at this point. In the before times, Sona, in the before times. Or in the in-between times.
I think it's the in-between times.
That's right. Yeah. It's like that. We were in the eye of the storm. Now we're back in the storm again. I have so many questions for your opinion of this story. Disclaimer, when we get to the end, as far as
I have so many opinions.
Yes, I can't wait to hear the opinions about how this all felt to you. But let's save that for the end. I was going to actually start the episode with that. Let's actually save that. That could be the last bite of the cake, let's say. And what we'll do now is let's just jump, just like the episode, let's just jump right into the plot and right into, very importantly, Catherine's story. The first note I have, her story, not like the book. I'll talk about the differences between the book, but in the series itself, she starts off her story talking about the day at the beach and
Mm-hmm.
how she ran into the water and she didn't have the courage to swim out to her son. And she does question herself, right? So I think we're seeing here, this is also the same in the book, by the way. So cleverly, we're seeing the way that she, or the guilt that she feels across multiple spectrums here. And you see it start here with the fact that she wasn't, in her mind, courageous enough to risk her life for her son. And she does hope that if there was a gun to his head or if there was a fire and that she needed to run and save him, that she would have been able to act. But she just wasn't a strong swimmer. And for whatever reason, she was unable to make that leap into the ocean. She was scared of the rough water. And then, of course, Jonathan comes out of nowhere, swims out to the sun, and she thinks to herself, anyone but him.
There was so much about this episode that just gutted me. And I
Yeah.
think possibly, bringing that parent perspective and
Mm-hmm.
baggage to it. I thought this actress was amazing
Yeah.
in this episode in conveying so much without even speaking. And Kate Blanchett as well, I
Yeah.
think was amazing in her voiceover of articulating things. It was just so interesting the way it was narrated to me of like, you
Yeah.
hear about men doing this all the time. Why
Right.
couldn't
Mm-hmm.
I do it? And I think she was raising so many ideas that are interesting to
Yeah.
think about, especially as a parent. I personally can barely swim. So I felt like I related on a very personal level to the helplessness she must have felt and the desperation of that. And it was like gut wrenching for me to watch that. I felt like it was just done in such a relatable way that you could put yourself in her shoes. And that idea, you as a parent, you're supposed to do anything for your child. You're
Right.
supposed to throw yourself in front of a bus for your child. But then when push comes to shove, do you do it? Is such an interesting question.
You asked me last week whether I recommend the book, and I was saying, "Oh, this is a very faithful adaptation." And I wasn't 100% sure if I would recommend the series, but I would recommend the book. And you're touching on it here. This narration is directly from the book, and this is the type of psychological detail in the characters, which is odd when I read the book because based on the reputation of the book and the series as well, I was expecting it to be much more like thrilling, to have more of those traditional thriller elements. Where what I really liked so much about the book, especially reading it in tandem with the series, is the psychological depth of these characters, right? And this is an example of it, exactly like you said. It's funny that she says that you don't just hear that men go and rescue people more than you hear about women doing that when they're drowning. But of course, you've mentioned this before. So many times you hear stories about men drowning in trying to rescue these children or rescue their dogs or rescue their family members or whatever happens to be. And so to your point, like the fear she felt and that maybe a man can't stand by, even though like she's thinking like, I'm going to die doing this.
Right.
Whereas maybe a father would have jumped in and strong swimmer or not would have compelled himself to try and potentially die. Right. So yeah, and I think that you do see not only in that one commentary, but I think the show and the book as a source subject where most of this comes from explores this idea that deep down inside of her not saying this to anybody is this guilt, not the guilt of having an affair, which is what we expected this whole entire time, or at least that's how it was presented earlier on, but the guilt that she didn't take action to save her son, that she fears that she might have unintentionally invited this assault, or she fears that people will say that about her, right? So it's like all of this external judgment that is in a way driving her and the terrible outcomes of all of that.
It's just an interesting question to ponder. And honestly, not that anybody cares what I think, although I guess in a way that's what this show is about, what you and I think. In the end, I've always reconciled it to myself as I would feel a world without my child is not worth living. So I probably would do it because it would be like, what would life be anyway without this child?
Yeah. And then that actually will come up again later in our discussion. And she continues in revealing what happened that day. This is actually, I think, accurate in the mother's representation of this. And I guess this is some of the details that cut a little too close to the bone for her. In the novel, she looks and knows, like we see that in the recreation of the flashback, that it's like she's looking over. She kind of notices that he's struggling. She's not drawing anyone's attention to him. This is in the fictionalized version of the story. And she lets him drown to a large extent. And there it's like you let him drown because this was an inconvenient truth. In a way, that's exactly what she did, even though she admits that. But of course, she is full of rage and hatred
Yes.
for him, which is very different, right? It's not that she's just like, you're inconvenient to me. He's a monster, really a monster.
Well, listen, that whole warning that we've kind of been joking about,
Yes,
right, in the beginning, like really came to bear this episode
sure.
in a way that was much more grim than anything I had imagined. I really think what we were shown, and we'll get there, is so much worse than
Right.
anything
Mm-hmm.
I had
Yes.
thought as far as where this story was going. But okay, practically speaking, I still have a question about how the mother could have put together such an accurate version of what
Yeah.
happened. But okay.
Yes. Yes. I agree with all of that, by the way. Before we move on from that, I do want to call something out that I told you I was going to call out and I forgot, and now I will, which is that we got a negative review on
Yes.
our Apple Podcast review saying that we had spoiled the end of the series. I believe if this listener's still out there, I hope that they listened beyond wherever they dropped off and realized that we were just speculating and we had not read the book. We could not have read spoiled this series since we had not seen it. And I personally had not read the book, and Sona has not read it either. So we were just speculating on it. And by the way, when we're saying there's a sexual assault that's going to happen, it's because the placard at the beginning of every single episode tells us there's a sexual assault that's going to happen. So I'm sorry. I do not consider that a spoiler when I'm just reading what is on the screen. I'm sorry. That is part of the viewing experience.
It's more deductive reasoning.
Yes. So I do apologize. And if you're still out there, I do hope you revise your review of us. And most importantly, everybody out there, if you do listen to us on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review to
balance that out.
Balance that out, hopefully. And if you take that as an incitement to give me a 1-star review, I'd say, if you have any critique of the show, I'd love to hear any critique of the show. Drop us an email, send us an email to needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. But don't give us a 1-star review. Just listen to us. That's fine. I'm sure most people don't want to hear us. So,
and I will say also, you are excellent at responding to feedback that we get. So it doesn't just go into a black hole.
Yes.
Victor is actually reading it and will follow up with you.
And I always loop Sona in too.
Yes.
All right. So after that digression, yes. So we finally get the sexual assault, of course. But yeah, even before that, there's the whole brutal revelation that she has that she did see him suffer, struggling. She hoped he would drown. She was happy that he was dead. And of course, this is all very brutal revelation to Stephen. But she yells at him that she's not done with her story yet.
I loved Kate Blanchett in this scene in the kitchen. First of all, the amount of adrenaline that must have been in this character's body to counteract whatever he drugged her with, so that she could get through this whole story in such a coherent manner is remarkable, because it was not a short story. But also, I thought it was so beautifully done. You can feel her energy. You can feel her frustration. I just loved all the, like, I am not done talking. Exactly. All of it, I thought, was fantastic.
We return to the flashback, and finally she says, you need to hear about what happened the night before, which she teases out that she was exhausted from the night before. She did indeed fall asleep on the beach. So a lot of those details are true, but not for the reasons he thought. And finally, she gets to the really ugly heart of this whole story. And of course, there's, once again, I think very well conveyed this internalized guilt she has. She left the key in the door. Why did she leave the key in the door? Did she smile at him too much and invite him there? So there's all this victim blaming, which is interesting, that it's internalizing, which I think is really cleverly subtle, right? It's not like a big thing. It's not like she invited him to the room and then it went too far. She's blaming herself, even though these are very subtle cues that I think is, I think it's important too.
Yeah. And she's had 20 years to sit with this and turn it over in her head and think about all the ways that maybe it could have gone differently. So I think it was very realistic.
It's a very sad revelation she makes, that first of all, we'd heard in the separate narration, she had sexual fantasies about this young guy and the interest he was showing in her. And she sadly says it to the dad that in her mind, like she doesn't actually explicitly say, I fantasized about your son, but she says, in my mind, he was so kind. And of course, this is the exact opposite of anything she could have possibly imagined. This is a truly brutal sexual assault.
Yes.
I have a little technical question for you here. Could you hear the dialogue in the flashback? Was this a mistake? Because it was weird. Like, I couldn't hear what they were saying to each other. I mean, and by the way, the things he's saying to her are disgusting. And I think they are important to the context of what's happening, because he's like saying in that flashback, I'll cut your face. I'll, kill your son. Like, horrible things that he's pressuring her with. And I only knew that because I had my subtitles on. I always have my subtitles on my TV. That's the only reason that I knew that, because the audio itself was so muffled I couldn't hear it. I don't know if that was a stylistic thing.
That's so interesting that you bring that up because I actually was so anxious to watch this that even though my husband was watching the football game on TV, I watched it on my phone, which I
Mm.
never do, but I was that anxious to see this. And I had my old school that came with an iPhone headphones plugged in. And I thought, like, oh, something's weird with the sound here. And so
Yes.
then
Mhm.
I always watch with the captioning on as well. Then I unplugged them and I was just watching quietly. And I did notice something was weird with the sound, but I chalked it up to being on my phone and then the headphones coming in and out. And so I just kind of relied on the subtitles and I didn't question it. But you
Yeah.
make a good point, technically. I think there's something, I don't know if it was purposeful or not, but I did notice it.
It's odd that I don't know if it was an intentional stylistic choice or if it was a technical mistake. This is way more technical than anybody wants to know.
Yes,
But if you
yes.
have, especially if you have the AirPod Pros, Apple is doing something experimental. They're using their own movies and TV content as an experiment with their audio technology. So what they do is they use AI to move the sound inside of the show. And I think you can still hear it even with the plugged earphones, by the way. One example of where it's very explicit at the beginning of the episode where she is stirring the tea is so loud because like we're close to the spoon spinning and her voice is
Mm-hmm.
like in the background. And then when this is a very interesting point, if anybody wants to rewatch the show, watch it this way. Just rewatch the first 5 minutes of this episode with your headphones on. And what you'll see is when she's speaking and telling her story and she's close to us in the camera, you're going to hear her closer to you. Her voice will be louder and it'll be like in your right channel. And then we
Hmm.
flip to Steven's point of view, even though he's not talking, instead of just having flat sound like you normally do, she's now further away from us. So they are using this spatial technology to put the people in the space. And now they're training their models to do this because of their VR headsets. So that the idea is to create a volume of sound that
Interesting.
matches the visuals, because you can imagine with 3D, flat sound is very disorienting, right? As opposed to being like in your headset and you can hear that someone's now far away from you because they sound far away from you, right? So they're using their own content, which is part of their investment in making this, so that they become like the premier relayers of this kind of virtual cinema, which is their goal long term. So that's very, very technical. I wonder if there's a mistake in the way that the audio is being created, that the flashbacks are like unintentionally, whether that was the filter they put on generically for things that are happening that are not in the room with the narrator, because it wasn't just your experience. I rewatched this on my Mac to see if
Mm-hmm.
there was something wrong with the audio in my first watching of it, because I had the same experience where it's not that she's even narrating. We only have the audio of the assault and everything is so muffled. I'm like you said, I'm like, is there something wrong with the audio? Like it was very strange. I wonder if people are going to be chattering about their experience of the audio here in this episode.
Hmm.
So that's a lot more context than probably anybody wanted to hear, but I thought it was interesting anyway. As a technologist, I find it interesting what they're trying to do and maybe the negative consequences of such. Yeah, let's get into the assault a little bit. This is really disturbing. It's the same
So
in the book. It's
awful.
even worse in the book, believe it or not. And but like he cuts himself. That's the cut on the arm that the mom
Mm-hmm.
noticed
Mm-hmm.
earlier. She mentions like, why is it cut that way? It's so precise. Of course, he cut himself, makes her drink his blood. This is so crazy. But yeah, that's in the book as well, by
Hmm.
the way, not an invention for the series. And of course, threatens her. And then, that this thing gets so protracted. It's 3.5 hours long in her telling of it. All the details are almost exactly out of the book. He does tell her to put the son to sleep. She does try to close the door on him, like subtly, just close the door so she could just lock the door. And then maybe he'll leave if she locks herself in, but he puts his foot in the door. He's always there, like watching her. He never leaves her alone. He's always within a few feet of her, even as she tries to put the son to sleep. Yeah, so all these details are the same in the book. And like I said, they're not, in some ways, not as impactful as seeing the visuals of it, because she tells her story so quickly in the book. She just knocks all the details out in one quick shot. It's only in just a few pages. And it's just like detail, 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 but it's very cold. We don't get the fire from her that Blanchett brings to her telling of it for sure. The worst part of it is when he, at the end says, thank you, that was nice, as if this
Mm.
was he is somehow writing this in his head as if this
Hmm.
was mutually appreciated. Crazy, right? It's just very crazy. But
Again, I give credit to the actress. I think she did an amazing job here, and to Kate Blanchett's voiceover as well, but just so difficult to watch. I hope anybody who would have a truly excruciating time watching this heeded the warning, because for me as a woman, it was very, very difficult to watch.
I actually took a note. Do we need to see as much of this? And not because, I mean, it is uncomfortable to watch, obviously, but it's not because I felt that seeing this much detail and all the recreation of almost everything that happens in the book, not that it was like, it's too hard for me to watch, they should soften this in some way. That's not my point. My point is, for me, in my personal taste, seeing less of it is actually worse because I can fill in the blanks myself.
Mm-hmm.
And having this drawn out for this extent of time isn't more impactful to me. It actually makes me think about, like, oh, those actors must have been very uncomfortable doing these scenes. Like, it makes me think too much about the making of what I'm watching. Like, my personal taste, it's a little distracting, and sometimes less is more. So I don't know if you had the same impression or if it was just but I'm very curious about that, right? Because you have men photographing this, a man directing this and writing these scripts. It is based on a book by a woman and very faithful to it. But I am curious, your perspective as a woman. Obviously I'm watching this and it's terrible, it's awful, and I honestly don't want to watch it. But
Yeah.
it's not going to hit me the same way as a woman, I would assume.
I think it was seeking to evoke a feeling, and it did. It may have evoked the same feeling if it had been not quite 100% of what we saw, but I
Right.
do think it was seeking to convey something, and it definitely made that point in spades. I also think they were trying to really thoroughly explain the photographs and
Yes.
how they came to be, because we did have such a different impression of them for 90% of what we saw.
Yep.
So I think in that way it kind of needed to go through all of this to explain how the photographs came to exist. In the end, it was massively difficult to watch, but I didn't feel like it was a torture porn kind of thing,
Right.
like kind of how I feel when I watch Ryan Murphy stuff, that I'm like, yeah,
Yes.
we got
Yes.
the point. You're
Yeah.
doing it now just to show that you can. And that you can show something so disturbing. I don't care. I'm not impressed by that. It didn't give me that feeling.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It was just torturous to watch because it went
Yeah.
on for so long.
So
I
awful.
agree. But yeah, the Ryan Murphy is a perfect example of this, where there is titillation in Ryan Murphy's. And some of that could be titillation, like sexual titillation, actually, even though it's inappropriate in those type of
Yeah.
contexts. But some of it is just like a prurient titillation,
Right.
like you said, where it's just like, how awful could this get? As if it's just like,
Yes.
oh, it could get even worse. It's like really
Yes.
trying to get a reaction. This, I think, was trying to just show, this experience is terrible, but imagine the length of it. Like, it's not a 5-minute experience, it's just
Yeah. Three
protracted.
and a half hours,
Yeah,
she said.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's even worse in the book because there's so much more detail in that. She explains that, like, how, at one point she like passes out with him on top of her and she's like trapped under him because she's so exhausted, and then he starts again, and it's just like,
Yeah.
and maybe they shot more of this, but yeah, you can only imagine, like, seeing it visually, we don't want to see another 10 minutes of this, right? So
No.
but in the book, where she could just say those words, in your
Yeah.
mind, of course, you're thinking, like, my God, whatever you see here, but imagine that like 5 or 8 times over the course of the
Yeah.
night. Like, it's just horrible. Yeah. And then the next morning she's exhausted and her son wants to go to the beach. We had a question, of course, like at the end of last week's episode, about, well, why didn't she go to the police? And maybe she was planning to. And that's exactly what we hear here, right? She says
Mm-hmm.
she actually did collect forensics evidence. She took photographs of the bruises and the bites and everything else that happened to her. And then, of course, when he died, she was just like, I never have to deal with this again if I
Right.
choose not to. And of course, I think that's the big theme here of the series, I believe, that, if there's something that maybe not so much in the book, but more in the TV show, I think slightly more so, is if you think you can just run away from this, and that if it's convenient to not confront it, she's basically damaged her relationship with her son. In
Mm-hmm.
her marriage is basically based on a version of herself that probably isn't real. She has run away from this and inside of herself for so long. This is like a huge unburdening for her, and she doesn't even realize it until now.
in a way, she was doing this out of pity for the parents, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
To say like, what will this help at this point to share this about your son who's just died, which I think is an interesting aspect of it as well.
Yeah, and it ends up being terrible for them as well. I guess the
Yeah.
only person who kind of benefits from this is the mother, right, who died of cancer
Yes.
before these revelations came. But even Stephen, he has been damaged by this, right, in the long run.
Yeah.
So a couple more details on the rape before we move past it. I did find it kind of interesting from the characterization of Jonathan, since we don't have an actual POV of him ever. It's always other people's versions of him. But this is the one where we are in the POV of one of our main characters. And he's obviously seems to be like an utter monster. I did think it was interesting that he ends the night as, and even more pronounced in the book, by the way, that he ends the night as in like that was like a great date he was on or something. Earlier on, when he's putting his foot in the door and imposing himself on her, it's not like there's a transition somewhere where he says, well, it started forcefully and then it became more consensual. That it's so ugly throughout that I mean, if he actually believed that she was on board with what was happening at any point, he's delusional.
Yeah. I mean, he is holding a knife to her most of the time.
Right. And yeah, even if she performs with in front of the camera, and maybe that's a way for him to relive this in a more positive light. I mean, the simple fact is, like in the moment, like you said, she's continuously, threatening her to get her to do anything. So it's
Yeah, and he's having to tell her to smile. Like it's clear that
yeah.
she is in misery.
It is strange that he wants her to smile in the photograph, though, right? So that in a way, he doesn't have to see the. I'll talk how this diverges in the book in some interesting ways, but I'll save all the book differences for once we get out of the universe of the series.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think for me, one of the toughest parts of the whole show, like for my taste, like I mentioned before, sometimes less is more. So a lot of the protracted nature of the assault makes it less impactful, ironically, for me. It's my taste. But I thought that Blanchett's performance afterwards is riveting when she's saying that she had all this evidence. She tried to like save the forensics, but in the end, she's like, well, maybe I don't have to deal with this. I have the option to not have to talk about it in front of court, prove myself, deal with the questioning, deal with the judgments, relive the details of it again. And she says, the only reason I'm telling you this at all is because I want you to stop. So it's like, in a way, he has violated her yet again, the father has here.
We've talked before about how no one was really likable in this series. But here, there is such a redemption of her character, at least for me, and an understanding of what she has been living with and coping with, and the energy that is coming across as someone who has been dealing with this entirely on her own for 20 years, finally being forced, she feels, to get all of this out onto the table is just really compelling to watch. And the revelation that comes after this is,
yes. Just as a frame for what happens in the book. At first, I was like, oh, this is very different than how it is in the book when I'm watching it and then listening to the book afterwards. I basically finished the book immediately after watching this. And I'm like, oh, there's all these details that are in the series that are not in the book. They actually are all there. They just come out later. Like they don't all come out at once. They're kind of like the abortion thing really comes very, very later. And that's the next detail that we find out she had an abortion. Which is like when you read the book, it comes even later on. You're like, oh God, as if, everything wasn't so bad already. Yeah. Here, they just get a lot of this just for efficiency as well. They get everything out in just 2 or 3 conversations from these different characters rather than over the course of weeks. Yeah. And then the sadness of they really wanted to have another child. That's the part that got me. They wanted to have another child. Now, this might have been her husband's child, by the way, right? But she couldn't know. And could she watch this kid grow up and think he's one thing and then discover he's something else? And would she resent him? And all of that is just such a complex, once again, driving home the fact that the complexity of what women need to deal with when they experience something like this, right?
Yeah. And I honestly don't know how she managed to make this marriage work, no matter how dysfunctional, for 20 years after something like this.
I mean, I guess in a way, I think it's kind of the point we see when you rewatch the show in some ways, if you were to rewatch it, and you think about those early scenes that I didn't even spend much time on, where she's doting on her husband and she's, everything's so happy. And he's still the person she looks forward to the most. And this is explicit in the book, by the way, that it's as if she, like the scales are falling away from her eyes with all of these revelations, that she realizes that even the marriage itself has been a performance. Like she's trying to, it's all been framed by that assault. And she's been trying to keep the marriage together because in that way her life is normal and she doesn't have to be alone and maybe with her thoughts or think about the fact that the assault had ruined the marriage in some way, right? All those things are things she, in a way, gets to hide inside the marriage.
Yeah.
And then she makes the realization that she's drugged and she passes out momentarily. And Stephen goes, don't worry, you're just going to fall asleep. I just got one more thing to do. And he heads out to the hospital with his weird syringe, which has a weird notch in it. I think you were right. I didn't notice that the first time. There is something bizarre about that syringe. I don't know. Maybe that's just what UK syringes look like, but there's something odd about it. I mean, it's fast paced, but it actually is like 20 minutes of the episode. Nick has woken up. There's this weird technique, which I found distracting, where there's like this zoom in. It's like we're on the set of ER all of a sudden. I don't know why they have this. I guess they're just trying to keep the tension up, even though all we're doing is watching Robert in the hospital, excited that Nick has woken up. And then we're intercutting with the basically this slow motion thriller sequence of the Uber or the taxi arriving at the hospital. And Stephen gets stuck in traffic. Catherine wakes up. This is actually a little slapstick for me, surprisingly, like her desperation for the iced coffee. It's very funny.
Same. Drinking out of like an ice bucket or whatever that was.
Exactly. She just like
it was very strange.
Just an entire bucket of instant coffee and water and ice and just chugging it down before the taxi gets there. Her taxi gets there. She's a few minutes behind Stephen.
If you're that desperate, like what's even the deal with the ice? Just
just suck it down, right?
I don't understand. And also, I had questions about the timeline here. I mean, again, I think she had a ton of adrenaline in her body. She's so close behind him, at least the way this is cut together. I don't understand. Did she just pass out for 10 minutes?
Well, I mean, she's receiving, if you see all the text messages she sends, and she's waiting for the Uber. I think all of that is compacted, I don't know the word I'm trying to say, because I think this is taking place over the course of like 15 or 20 minutes. But I think getting across London is going to take some period of time anyway. And then Stephen is probably at the bedside. We have to talk about that scene because it's a very powerful scene, at the bedside of Nicholas for probably let's say 5 minutes, 8 minutes. So all of this is being significantly.
I mean, it just seems like she's very close behind him for someone who's been drugged, but maybe I'm not understanding.
They're playing with the time frame, and that might be part of it too, right? Nick might have woken up. That definitely is off of a different time scale, because when they're extubating him and the dad is there and talking to him, and Nick's kind of giving the dad the cold shoulder and he's on oxygen, you have to assume that's taking place over the course of at least half an hour, right? Like they don't extubate somebody and your dad walks in 2 minutes later, right? And basically the taxi ride across town is happening over that period of time. So maybe she woke up 15 minutes into that and then she waited 10 minutes for an Uber or something. So, I mean, I think that's the timeline, but it is a little odd, but of course they're trying to manufacture tension here. And then of course, Stephen shows up. It seems like the nurse has a little sympathy towards him. They probably were there when he was knocked down. They treated him possibly even. So they're like, oh, let the old guy in there. And Sona, it's a failure of this socialist medical system that's understaffed. They almost let him kill the son.
Her beeper was going off,
Exactly. Yep. See, understaffed, I'm telling you. And why not have private rooms? That's what happens in the socialist government. I'm just kidding about all that.
It's very hard to get a private room in New York City, I'll tell you that.
That's true. Even New York, I know, right? Like we're so used to that here. And then some of this I thought was kind of silly. Some of it is kind of manufactured tension. And then Sona, somehow, miraculously, because Cuarón is actually really good at this, all the emotional beats in this episode hit me so hard. Stephen about to like kill this guy, and then Nicholas waking up and being like, Mom, I want to go. And what does that even mean? Does he want to go like he wants to die? Or is he remembering the time on the beach? And Stephen just melts. And that is like really powerful. But even more so when Kate Blanchett shows up and misunderstands, thinking that he's killed her son. Oh my God. This was like so emotional.
Heart-wrenching.
Yeah. That whole sequence when she is breaking down was really emotional for me. And then as she's reconciling or having this initial reconciliation with Nick, you see Robert confronting Stephen by the elevator.
Mm-hmm.
and saying, how could you not know about your son? And how come you didn't question this story? And he says, no, Mr. Ravenscroft, why didn't you? Right. Which, of course,
Yeah.
is the big question here that we've been asking
Mm-hmm.
multiple times. This is your wife. You should trust her, believe her, at least, no matter what else. You should hear her out, don't you think?
Yeah.
So, what'd you think about all that?
I just texted you one thing after I was done watching, which is I was riveted. I mean,
Yeah.
all of it, I was just glued to the screen. I thought it was all so compelling, so well done, raising so many interesting questions, which I do have an issue with all of this happening in the last episode,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
construction wise, but amazing the way it presented all of these really deep questions about relationships and parenting and marriage and all of it, I think was really interesting. And I also think it was fascinating to watch Mr. Brigstock's reaction to all of this, right? Like the initial denial that, like, no, you're making this up, couldn't possibly be my son. And
Right.
then realizing that, like, no, that is his son. And on some level, he knew that,
Right.
and that he has to accept that and what that means for, like, what he's built his life around for the last, I'm not sure how much time has elapsed here, you know, at least months, right? That this has been going on with the book, I would think.
I think it's years because we see timestamps in the novel itself. It's years that this is all like
Yeah.
from him discovering the book through publishing and all that. It's been like years of obsessing on this.
I mean, the acceptance of that reality and what that means for him and for his dead wife and all of it was just like really compelling. At the same time, I wish we'd spent more time with it.
Yeah. I have a question for you. One of the questions get raised here, and I don't have an easy answer for this, but I'm just curious to get your opinion of it. What do you think as far as seeing something in your child or just in a loved one, just a family member, just someone who you've been friends with for a while, who maybe has some significant moral issues, not necessarily like a violent rapist, but maybe some other significant character flaw, and how oftentimes we may, because we don't interact with that aspect of the person, we look the other way. How believable do you think that someone could, for example, have raised the child and seen these warning signs maybe earlier on and in this level of self-denial? What did you think?
I think it's so believable. And actually, this is my own neuroses. We turned over the question of, like, whether to be parents or not so many times in our heads before we actually did it, that we are very advanced age parents.
Mhm.
But one of the things that I always thought, and it seems really strange to even say it out loud, I'm not sure I've ever said it out loud to anyone, is what if I had a child that ended up being a serial killer or
Right,
whatever? Because I do think, there's this nature versus nurture question. Obviously,
right,
I would never nurture my child to be some violent criminal. But when you read about these people, it seems like it's something that was in them a lot of the time, or something terrible happens to them as a
right.
child that is beyond anyone's control. And I always thought, how would I ever live with myself knowing that I brought somebody into the world that hurt somebody else? That to me just seemed very hard to grapple with. I know it sounds a little bit bizarre. It is something that I thought about. And I think, yes, the easiest thing to do as a parent would be to rationalize it. How do you face that? And especially the fact that you can't nurture that out of someone necessarily.
We mentioned Ryan Murphy earlier, and I wasn't a huge fan of the Dahmer series, but I did recommend it. And one of the strongest aspects of that series, now we're going way off topic, but I still want to follow up with what you were saying. When we see Richard Jenkins giving a really, I think, Emmy nominated performance as his dad, and he wrote a book about Dahmer, the actual father did after Dahmer's death. And he even references, or I guess they excerpt parts of it to create those episodes in the show. But it's the idea that he saw that his son was struggling with these things. He saw very disturbing aspects of his personality. He was in denial to himself. And at one point, by the way, when there were these killings happening in the city, he wondered even, like, is it possible that this could be related to him somehow? But, as a parent, can you accept this about your child? Or, people who are married to criminals and don't know it,
Mm-hmm.
there's this willfulness to, you get presented a version of truth, and we just believe the convenient version of truth, if whenever we can, I think.
To take it even further afield, this now is reminding me of Dexter, right? Because
Right.
that father sees this exist in his
Right.
son and
Right.
tries to kind of get ahead of it in a very twisted way to say, like, well, if I can at least channel it so that he's not hurting good people, then I have done something, which is like a whole other level of question. We all have those kids that we joke about, right, with our parent friends about, like, oh, this one, the bad seed, right? Or
That
whatever.
kid's going to be a serial killer.
But, we never really think that
Right.
they're going to do something so awful. But these people are out here and they came from somewhere, so.
There's a tendency to blame the parents for these things. And sometimes you can't always, it's not always nurture, like you said. It might be
No, I
nature.
think you often cannot nurture that out of people. It's just kind of how they're wired. But it's very scary. It's very, very scary as a parent to think about that and the idea of your child causing so much pain to somebody else purposefully.
And if you want to explore these topics further, Dexter Original Sin is coming in December. So join us here for our full coverage of that series. I don't know if we'll do full coverage of that series, but we will sample it at least.
I mean, I've always maintained that was a critical mistake on the part of Dexter's guardian. But who knows? Maybe I'll have a different perspective on it.
Training him to be a killer, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess there's pluses and minuses. In the show, we see that Stephen burns everything that belongs to Helen, blames her almost exclusively for creating this fantasy version of their son. He burns all the remaining belongings of hers and the photographs and the remaining books, everything. I'm not sure he's getting and even the ring, right? I'm not sure he's getting the full. I'm not sure he's fully taking responsibility for his culpability in this as well. This is a little bit from the book that I'm going to introduce here, but didn't touch on some of these things when I was doing the book recap because I thought they were putting the thumb on the scale. Earlier on, when they are cleaning up his apartment, the son's apartment, he finds some violent porn. He doesn't go into explicit details as to what he finds, but he hides it away from the mother so it wouldn't upset the mother. In his internal narration, he basically, as he's burning everything in the book, he's thinking to himself, like, I saw the warning signs. I knew what this kid was like. And there's even more there, which I find really fascinating, touching on some of the themes you said. He's talking about how the kids would come to the house for play dates, but really like to hang out with the mother because she was so kindly, but they really didn't like playing with Nick. And if people came over for play dates, they wouldn't come back. Oftentimes the parents wouldn't want them to come back. So they saw something dark in the son. As a matter of fact, he kept getting in trouble in school. This is once again all from the book. The mother even started working in the school so she could be closer to him. So she was always trying to basically mediate what they saw within their son. And then he says, and then he became an adolescent and he became darker and they couldn't control him as much. And they thought that him traveling on this trip with this girlfriend who apparently he had only known for a short period of time, they thought that this was him really starting to turn over a new leaf and be a more social person. And then, of course, when the girlfriend came back, and once again, he never heard from Helen, he blames himself. Why didn't I ever ask her for details of what happened when why she came back and why she was so angry at Jonathan? I think I called him Nick. I meant Jonathan.
You did, yeah.
And
but
then
you were on a roll, so I don't
yeah, sorry about that. We're talking about Jonathan here, just to be clear. So yeah, so he thought that things were going in a positive direction for him. And why didn't he ask more questions? So in the book, his narration is not like, she tricked me, which I thought was like, that's a little not the right read on a lot of these things. But he was really much more like, she built this fantasy we lived inside of, and I'm culpable for buying into it. It's what I wanted to believe, but there's all these dark aspects of him that I didn't want to accept. And that's why I was asking that question of, it's even more pronounced in the book. If you see this and you see it growing over time, are you culpable, or do we just want to see the best things in our loved ones? Like, I feel sympathy for him is my point, even though he maybe should have been a little more aware.
Yeah, I think I felt sympathy too. It's such a large responsibility to be a parent that we bear, right? To try and raise good kids who will bring positive things into the world. And the idea of feeling that you didn't accomplish that is devastating.
Yeah. And those are the things we fear about, obviously this is, in a way, in a nutshell, this whole book is those two extremes. What if your child is a monster? And then do you feel responsibility for that? Although to your point, it's only kind of revealed at the end that we can even grapple with that. Because, of course, the earlier part of the book is all dealing with the fact of like what happens when you lose your child, and like, is it the end of your life too? Right. So it's kind of very much an inversion of this character. There's so many inversions, and unfortunately, they don't really reveal themselves until later on. But I guess it's things that we can think about after the fact, because so many things have been flipped over. She's a predator. No, he was the predator. The tragedy of losing a child, the relief in a way that this person died, right? Like, so they don't have to deal with these ugly consequences. They get to have the heroic version of him in perpetuity, basically. And all these things are inverted here at the end. Even like the loser son who may be carrying a trauma from his childhood, right?
Yes. And I mean, I think also part of what, I mean, it's obvious, I'm just saying it out loud, but we haven't explicitly discussed Cate Blanchett having to grapple with everything, Catherine having to grapple with everything that's happened to her, and knowing that her son is only here because of that person, or possibly, anyway, who knows what the outcome would have been had he not swum out there. But that's a whole other thing to have to deal with, that he saved the most precious person in your life.
Yes, exactly. So there's that duality there too, that she can't forget that.
Yeah.
If he had died, her son, and totally unrelated to the sexual assault, that she wouldn't have her son. And this guy did this thing. She has to be appreciative of that, and how much she internalizes that hatred, that she has to be appreciative to the person who did the worst thing possible to her.
Right. Exactly.
She has this conversation with her husband. In the book, all of this happens over a much longer period of time, by the way, over the course of weeks or maybe even months. Everything here happens in like 2 or 3 scenes, which is like, for brevity, I'm fine. I don't need another episode of the show, to be honest. But she makes this realization. She's been performing this marriage, and part of the reason she's always been trying to be a version of herself that she would admire, that her husband would admire, because she has this like internalized guilt, and that she's just exhausted from carrying this on her back. And it's simultaneously her realizing that the marriage doesn't really work because she's always been doing this emotional work. And that's part of the reason she's inflicted herself with this. But also, I think, very cutting, and we see it in the dialogue explicitly in the show, this really difficult exchange she has with him, which is absolutely true, where she's saying, like, you are dealing with my horrible rape in such a much more successful, and that you are more accepting of that, even relieved, rather than thinking that I had an affair because I was unhappy in the marriage, which of course bruises your ego. But when you think about that, this would probably be the case in almost any marriage. So I don't think that he's uniquely in this way. Being confronted with that, I agree with her. How do you continue with the marriage at that point?
I think it was fascinating, to the point that this is very close to the end of the episode.
Right.
When it ended, I turned to my husband and I said, I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question that seems unhinged, but it's based on what I just watched. And I asked him, would you rather this or that? And first he said to me, oh, well, that's a common question. And I said, what? And he said, he gave me an example of this figure that was like popular in our culture. I don't want to go down the road of this, but apparently a woman, claimed that she was sexually assaulted. The person said that no, it was consensual. And an argument was being made that, well, she said that she was sexually assaulted because she knew that her husband would not like hold that against her. That's not a good phrase, but it would be easier for her husband to accept that than the idea that she had a one-night stand. So he gave me an example from actual real life where that argument came up. But I said, okay, but that's something else that happened, but I'm asking you, how would you feel? And he said he refused to discuss it with me.
For me, as a man looking at this, I understand, honestly, where my reaction might have been the same, where I would have been wounded by the affair and now very sympathetic to this absolutely horrible thing. Mm-hmm. And I do think I would probably react similarly. And simultaneously, it's putting me on the other side of that. If I was receiving that response, that like, now you're cool with it. Mm-hmm. It's not that like that he's so selfish that he's reacting this terrible way. It's more the realization that I would probably do the same thing. And simultaneously, if that was my experience on the other side of that, I'd be like, now that I have seen this, I don't think I can unsee it. It's like it's the end of this marriage, really.
Of course, it's right to be upset if your partner had an affair, right? It's not saying that like you should be so understanding about that. But this particular character in this particular circumstance, he really was punishing her for something that, she even makes the point when he's saying, why didn't you tell me? She said, I tried to tell you. He wouldn't even give her the opening to share this extremely painful thing. When she said, please give me a chance, no, he shut her down immediately. Definitely it resonates in this particular situation, the dichotomy of that. I want to say, like, I do understand why someone would be upset about having an affair. I'm not saying you shouldn't be upset.
Yeah. And I feel the same way. I think that, I mean, I'm 100% in agreement with all that. And to that point, I'm empathetic to his presumption of the affair and his offense by that. Absolutely. But to the broader point, even if it had been the case, the fact that he was so wounded that he wouldn't even hear her out.
Punishing her. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And then when the alternative happens, this horrible, horrible realization comes and he is, dealing with it way more successfully than the other is a profound revelation. Right. So,
yes.
So yeah, that's the end of that marriage.
As confirmed by the voiceover.
Right.
We talked about how Stephen is burning all of the stuff. We didn't talk about that scene with the photograph. Is that, I can't remember if it's broken up in the timeline or not. We might be still going according to the timeline of events. I just want to make sure we get to that.
We might have skipped that, but yes, because that does happen when he's burning things. And that is a devastating scene. And it does circle back to only my last note here, which is, of course, the reconciliation with Nick at her quaint little house she moved into after the divorce. This beautiful, palatial house she's living in.
I think even on Apple TV in the app, it's described as a thriller. I don't really think this is a thriller, but there was something really chilling about the way that scene was shot and seeing the kid in the photograph. Seeing Nicholas in the photograph off to the side, it really was bone chilling for me.
He was there and he saw. Yeah. And, in the book, this is even more pronounced. She thinks to herself as she's making this revelation. She makes the revelation. I'll talk about the differences there. But in her interior dialogue, she's thinking, like, all this time, I thought I was protecting this from him. And even in that final moment, just like in the series, she lays it all out with him, with Nick, and we just only catch the end of it. And he doesn't remember it. He's like, I don't remember any of that. So he didn't have that recollection, but she assumes, given that explicitly, once again, this is in the book, she thinks to herself how their relationship was never the same after that trip, that whether she thought he was dreaming it or whatever, however he had compartmentalized it in his own mind, that he did see it. And that did taint the relationship with the mother. And that's the very important point, is that she was like, I thought that I had kept my mouth shut all this time to keep this from invading the family. And it was in me the whole time. It was in Nick the whole time. And then, of course, it came right into the public eye at the end of all this. Yeah. So she should have talked or said something earlier. That's the message. The very simple message of this series is that she should have said something earlier. And she probably should have gotten divorced a long time ago. Or gone to the police. Yeah, another good point.
This is separate from what you're saying. Some really beautiful moments of the reconciliation of.
Oh yeah, this final moment is beautiful. The score, this beautiful score by Phineas, really in its full bloom here at the very end, which has kind of been hinting at this reconciliation, basically. And then fading to white, right? We always fade to black at the end of each one of these episodes, and we have this brightly lit room with these white walls, and the fade to white at the end. So at the end, a little glimmer of hope. A beautiful fresco on the roof, on the ceiling in the hotel room during her rape, though. Not really what you're supposed to be paying attention to at that point, but we did get a nice shot of it there.
Yeah.
All right, a couple of nitpicks here at the end. So all that weirdness we were talking about, the discrepancies and what's going on with the narrators, with the photos, I guess a lot of this stuff is forgiven. The recasting of just the one main character, the most recognizable person in the cast, probably was all just whatever. Not sure. We speculated on, is this telling us this is when we're looking at the book versus reality?
Okay, I still maintain that they did not need a different actress for that.
Exactly.
But also the idea that you had picked up on Robert, Catherine's husband. his lock screen
Yes. Mm-hmm.
was younger Nicholas, but with
Right.
Cate Blanchett. Like, I mean,
Right.
none of it is
Exactly. Minimally
tying
all
through.
right. Minimally all they needed to do was put the other actress's face on that shot and they would have
Yeah.
resolved just I mean, that's like an insert shot. They could have done that post-production. I don't understand how they missed it.
Because I mean, we're talking about Cate Blanchett's own recollection of this thing that happened to her, and it's the other actress. It doesn't, I
Exactly.
mean, you got
Exactly.
to be consistent 1,000% with something like that,
Yeah.
or it's blown. And I mean, I still don't even accept the need for having a different person there.
Yeah. I mean,
Although I do think the acting was incredible.
yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And this actress does a great job. But
Yeah.
I would have, yeah, I would have made different decisions in that adaptation. Like you mentioned, I had the other actress on the lock screens, have the other actress do the flashback with the mom. It's, now we're going back 10 years. How does she, it's just odd where you're using one actress versus the other. Or I think another way you resolve this is in the final revelation, when she's telling her story, Blanchett plays herself, right? Like, that's it. Because the other
Yep.
one was a fictionalized version of her.
Exactly.
That makes sense too, right? So
yes.
yeah, I mean, I think all these really weird things in that is just what my biggest nit to pick here for sure. Other than that, my other big nitpick is that this should have been a binge rather than going week to week because so much is waiting for the final shoe to drop that you may very well have lost the people who need to see this. I actually want to call that out. I read a few reviews of this show, negative reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. These are not professional critics, so I'm curious to just see general public. And the audience score on this show got worse and worse on there. And I was curious to look at why the tide had turned. And I was looking at some of the more recent reviews, and I find it very funny that people are like, everyone in this show is disgusting, especially the Catherine character. And I'm thinking, these people who basically think Catherine's disgusting, look what she did, are buying in 100% on the fictional narrative. And I'm like,
yes.
that person who hates this show is the person who most desperately needs to see
yes.
the finale, but they won't stick around for the finale. So that explains, for me, I'm like, that is the gut punch that is going to come is the more vested you are in the negative version of her. And those people probably are going to quit the show before they get here. So that is a big problem for selling the show in a way.
I have a similar issue, which I mentioned, is that I just think so many fascinating ideas were raised in this last episode that I would have rather had more time with those and the way they played out and the character psychology. I feel like we needed somehow, I have no suggestion for how I would construct this differently, but I feel like a lot of this needed to start happening in the penultimate episode so that I could see it play out more because I just found it so compelling.
One simple fix, I think I agree, is you could imagine a version of the story where she tells her story in the previous episode. And then we get to spend a week mulling over, wow, I so misconstrued this story. And it could end, by the way, if you want a final beat, it could end with her being like, what did you put in my tea? And she collapses to the ground. And he goes, you just go to sleep. I have one more thing to do, and walks out the door. That would be an incredible cliffhanger for this week's episode. And we would have that breathing room to be like, oh my God, I can't believe this guy's going to go kill her son. And she's the victim this whole time instead of putting it all here. Like we don't have that time to, I mean, the whole point of doing a series, I think, in HBO, for example, Penguin and the success of that show, it's changing our expectations and then giving us a week to think about it, right? Not to be like, hang on for the finale, hang on for the finale. I'm like, how many weeks do I have to hang on for the finale? Like, give me the finale now if that's going to be the case, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to get into the differences with the book. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we transition?
Just my closing thought on this series was that the last episode was so amazing. I guess I'm still deciding whether it redeems some of the other episodes because I really thought it was fantastic, but I struggled with the construction of this story. And, as we were discussing, I think there probably was a better way to tell this story.
Because, I think you really need to make it to the end to make that assessment.
Yes.
And as a binge, I mean, it's the same amount of hours you're watching, but as a binge, you get that reward much more quickly. So I think it doesn't feel as frustrating.
Yes.
And just to double down on what you're saying, I think I also have an issue with the length of the series. I think they include almost everything from the book, so there's value in that. But this isn't a book; it's a TV show, and the realities of that is honestly, you could cut out half of the book and put this all into a movie, and it gives you that gut punch. And I think it works better. But of course, this is TV. It's not a movie, yada, yada. So you could make this into 4 episodes, let's say, or 4 slightly longer episodes. So they're like 4 1 hour and 10-minute episodes. So it's, once again, almost the same length of time. It's 4.5 hours versus 4 hours, a little over 4 hours. You could definitely make it work in a more compact number of episodes. And I don't understand that anyway. Like Netflix, a perfect example of this. I don't understand why I'm watching those shows. And I feel like, why is this protracted for 10 episodes? This would be better at 5 episodes. And do we need the extra? I mean, they release stuff as a binge. They're not going week to week. Why do they even make these shows this long? I don't even get it. But it makes sense to them somehow. I'm not sure how. I guess it's the number of minutes that people are watching. But once again, for Apple and Netflix, you're not running ads. Well, why do you need more length? It's like, you just want subscribers, right? It's just bizarre, I got to say. And a frustration for me for watching stuff on TV. I just feel like in the end, I'm watching a movie that's 7 hours long when I would never, ever sit down and watch a 7-hour movie. There are so many movies that are 3 hours long that are still on my back burner because I can't make time to watch them. And then I'm wasting 5 hours watching a show that has one good episode. It's just crazy, but that's the world we live in. All right, let me get into some differences with the book. Some big ones. Sona, the dosing of the tea doesn't happen in the book. Doesn't happen.
No.
The race to the hospital doesn't happen in the book. The tender scene at Nick's bedside, Stephen thinking about poisoning him and then melting at that moment. All the best stuff in this final episode doesn't happen in the book.
So interesting.
The mother running in, my beautiful boy, thinking that he's died, doesn't happen in the book. None of that happens in the book. The whole center of this episode does not occur in the book at all.
Well, good job to whoever added them. They're very powerful.
It's Cuarón. Cuarón wrote every script and directed the film, so it's all him. And to be honest, this is another critique I'll say. Other than those changes, which I loved, I thought they made the most powerful episode moments in the entire series are from him. And not to disparage the book. The book's a different thing, and of course, a novel is a very different thing. You're inside of people's heads. It's not a TV show. He should have been more loose with his adaptation, basically, I think, my opinion, with other things within the story as well, instead of really going beat for beat, like almost page for page for large sections, and then saying, well, how do I make this cinematic at the end? You could have rearranged so many details in the story, revealed them in a different order, rather than being so locked into what was happening in the book. And to your point, that could have been more satisfying. And there's no reason that you couldn't have some more layers to the narratives we're seeing, or adding additional characters, or had a flashback sequence last episode to the girlfriend's experience. Like, what happened to her? How did he traumatize her? And then as a tease for the final revelation, you're like, oh, this guy's not what we expected, because now we're seeing him from a unbiased point of view, right? All these things could have been potentially better ways to slice the story up or modify it. So yeah, I wish he had done more loose adaptation earlier on. As I mentioned, the sexual assault's even more explicit, but everything we see here is in the novel. There's even more of it, which maybe for me, okay, I don't necessarily want to see all of that anyway. So in the book, as I mentioned, none of those thriller elements happen. Stephen immediately believes her. She walks out. She apologizes to him. She goes, I'm sorry, like I had to tell you this. She gets up from the table. So everything else pretty much the same. Gets up from the table and she walks out. She's broken into his house. Same thing. She breaks the window. And he's just kind of stunned, and he is silenced by her and doesn't immediately attack her, and does almost immediately. He does question her at first, like in his own mind, he's questioning the narrative, but he starts piecing it together and starts to realize there were these warning signs. There were these things about his son. And that's where I think there's a lot more richness there of this understanding of who his son really was. And it's all in that internal remodeling or recontextualization of the things he had believed about his son. In a way, the fact that he was so vested in this narrative and become so obsessed with it was this doubling down. It was reading that book that his wife had written, and now he had a more convenient way to read what he maybe suspected was not what it appeared to be, you know? And then there's the photographs. Very important. I would have assumed this would have been more pronounced because film is a visual medium. He looks at the photographs after she leaves that are sitting there on a table, right? And we even see it here. And she's like, disparagingly shoving them off the table because she's disgusted by them.
Yeah.
He looks at those photographs after she leaves and he goes, what did I see in her face only now in revisiting them the fear on her face. How could I
Mm,
have missed that before?
mm,
And then he says, he looks at the pictures of her on the beach and he goes, she's feeding her son. At one point, she's looking directly into the camera. And this is something I actually speculated on the last episode, but it's not like she's looking at a lover or something. She's just looking into the distance. She doesn't know she's being photographed. It's like a
hmm.
paparazzi shot.
Yeah.
And then he's realizing this only now with this new context. And he goes, and
Hmm.
what do I see when I'm inside the bedroom? Those pictures are very different. He's very close by, and they're not naturalistic in her
Hmm.
behavior. They're posed, they're performed.
Hmm.
And what do I see on her face? There's a smile, but there's this fear in her eyes, right?
Mm.
I actually think, by the way, that the actress in the flashback sequences conveys that a little bit. There's a
Oh,
scene where
absolutely.
you see her like
Absolutely.
furrowing her brow as she's smiling, and
Yeah.
she's really conveying those two things simultaneously, which is really,
Yeah.
really well done. Avalanche of revelations for him, and he gets very angry in his recollections of Helen for not necessarily here where he's like saying like, oh, he's angrily burning her stuff, being like, oh, she tricked me with this story she wrote, which I think is kind of the wrong way to read what the book is saying there. He's angry at Helen, but he's actually angry at how throughout the relationship with the son, she was always making excuses for him. She was always
Hmm.
trying to reframe the things he did in a positive light or make him the victim. And in a way, he blames her to some extent for creating this child, right? But he's also blames himself for being blind to it for so long, or to allow himself to believe the narrative that she was creating.
On a much smaller scale. That's something that you do see in parenting, that parents make excuses for their kids' improper behavior. And I'm talking on a much smaller scale, like stealing toys or hitting. And then you go home and you talk about it with your partner about like, why didn't they correct this child's behavior instead of rationalizing why it was okay to do this thing that in my mind is bad parenting. You do see that. And I guess, the natural extension of that could be much darker, right? If you have that nature of rationalizing your kids' improper behavior, it might not find an endpoint, even when the behavior clearly crosses a line that nobody could possibly rationalize.
Yeah, I think that's relatable in a weird sort of way, considering how extreme some of this behavior is.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying on a much smaller scale, you
Right.
do see it.
Some of the details there, all of this is more protracted. Her and Robert, because we don't have that big confrontation like they do in the series. Her and Robert are continue to avoid each other. She has not told
Mm.
him. They're literally coordinating visiting Nick when he wakes up, and avoiding each other. Within probably weeks of that confrontation in the hospital, maybe even days, actually, I think now that I think about it, probably just days, he does sit down with Robert and he starts to tell him exactly what happened. He just literally sits down and goes right into it, as Stephen in the book is very abrupt in general. And he's like, Jonathan raped your wife. I was wrong about everything. And Stephen says that. And then Robert doesn't even know how to react. He's like, what are you saying? And he's just like,
Hmm.
and it's even more annoying in the book because he goes, and you believe her? And he's like, I believe her. I believe everything she said. Right. So it's like,
Mm.
even then he's, once again, he's vested in now this story, which is like burned his relationship with his wife. And then once he does see this, they're at the bedside. It's just like she feels his arm around her. It's really the what is all much more truncated. The same dialogue, by the way, at that moment where he goes, why didn't you
Hmm.
question it, Mr. Ravenscroft? And then he goes upstairs, he puts her arm around her. And by the way, she reconciles with him. He actually is
Hmm.
with him for a period of time, although eventually they do divorce, but it's all more
Hmm.
drawn out. She doesn't just have a conversation where she goes, I can't believe you didn't believe me. At first, she's actually relieved, like, okay, things are back on track. And then as she's like sitting in it for a period of time, because the story continues in the book for maybe a month or more, even after what happens in the series here, the son, his recovery is much slower. We kind of go through it a little bit,
Hmm.
but he does fully recover also. It just doesn't happen as quickly. And but in that period of time, she's like, I don't think I could be married to this guy anymore, for all the reasons she lays out explicitly in the series itself. But I do think it's a little more naturalistic in the way that that's played out. At one point, when they don't think Nick's going to fully recover or he might even backslide, she contemplates suicide. It's very brief, but just want to call that out because you mentioned the fact that, like, if you've lost your child,
Yeah.
what is there to live for in a way?
What happens in the book? Is it covered? What happens to her professional life?
She quits her job. They don't explicitly say this in the series. I don't know what we're supposed to draw from that, honestly. But in the book, at the very beginning of the final chapters, I guess her final chapter, she's literally in therapy. The therapy she has to have,
Finally.
but she hates her therapist. She's in
Oh,
therapy, and she quits her therapy. Once she quits her job, she quits her therapy. The therapy was imposed by like the HR department. She has a very bad relationship with her therapist, who seems to be blaming her for everything. And she's just frustrated with the situation. But she does say, by the way, Sona, she does say at the end that I'm not going back to that therapist. Maybe she will go to therapy eventually with someone like she chooses, right? So there is a little glimmer of hope that she does realize she has to talk to somebody about things. I do think she makes that revelation that she shouldn't have held this inside. I think she just doesn't think that her current therapist is useful to her. But I do think she is.
It's hard to find a good therapist. I get it.
Yeah. So I think she does acknowledge that. But it does seem that the book itself seems to be a little wary of an over-reliance on therapy, I think.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. So she quits her job. She doesn't know what her future has to hold. They're not as rich as I mentioned. Here, he's like multimillionaire, her husband.
Yeah,
but you would assume that even with a divorce, she probably got a decent amount of money or something. In the book, they're never that flashy. He does work for that nonprofit. He's a lawyer. They do have a nice house, but they're not like you never got the impression they're like multimillionaires or anything like that. And she actually moves in with her mom, where she's been anyway. And that whole reconciliation she has with her son happens at her mom's house. The son is actually hanging out with the grandmother. The grandmother's happy to see him. He hasn't been spending a lot of time with the grandmother when he was going down into this rabbit hole of drug addiction. And then basically the reconciliation, which is almost exactly like it is in the book, is happening there at the mother's house.
That's nice to me that it's like a resolution of a lot of things.
Exactly. And I
wish we had seen more of that.
And there's more to it than that. So Stephen moves back into his own home. He starts to clean up his garden. So he starts to like cut back all that the weeds and the overgrownness of it. He really likes it. He starts to enjoy, like he's talking about how sometimes you need to prune things back to make sure they can grow strong. He builds a bonfire, not just this little fire pit he has here. It's like it looks like it's just a grill that he has where he's burning things in the TV show. He actually makes a bonfire in his backyard. The neighbors are always complaining about it. And he
feels like it would be smoky. Yes.
Yeah. And he also throws some of his wife's things in there, but most of the stuff he actually gives away to the same group of ladies that come to clean out the house. He just gives them more stuff, but he does burn some of it. He doesn't find a photograph in the fire like he did there. He actually finds a negative. In the olden days, when you had a negative, sometimes they would give you a negative, but no print, where they thought it was like a dud. When he looks at that print, which was never developed, he realizes that there's like this ghostly figure. Everything else is out of focus. And that ghostly figure in white, basically like in the light, like we saw here in the show, is the son. And like that revelation is so traumatic to him that he realizes that in so many ways that there's even more damage done here, even to addicted son who probably, witnessed this, and it's probably traumatized him for life. And he leaves that for Catherine, because what he ends up doing is throwing himself on the bonfire.
What?
Yeah. And we only hear about this in passing. The last time we hear from him, he's actually writing a letter and putting things together. And he has another plan of things that he wants to do. And what he does is he leaves Catherine the house and the apartment. He writes her a letter that says, I don't want you to think about this as some kind of payoff for your misery. I just want something positive to come of this. She actually doesn't take it that way. At one point, she goes into the house. She's really not happy to be in the house. She does appreciate that the garden is very well manicured. And there's a big burn mark in the middle of the patio where he died, basically. So she does, in a way, have to deal with this again. So he's not necessarily doing her that many favors. But considering she's not loaded, I guess she could take this money. She plans to sell the house. She explicitly says that. And I guess she take the house and the apartment and erase that part of her past, or at least move on from it, and use that money to get herself somewhere else to live in the future. And things are open-ended. She'll get work somewhere else at some point. She's just thinking about taking some time off and figuring out her life in the meantime. So it's kind of a positive place for her to be on. Stephen's very sad. It's like he says to himself, his son had never done a selfless act in his life. And he was just so entitled.
Yeah, he says that in the show as well.
Right. He mentions that why was he heroic that day? And then he asks himself, he was a very strong swimmer. He says, did his son look at himself in the mirror, and that he had taken this fantasy and transgressed for the first time? And did he recognize in himself that he was down this dark path, like this would happen again? And Stephen even questions, is even this version that his son did something heroic? and then sacrificed himself, maybe even allowed himself to drown because he knew that his life would only get darker from this point on. He goes, isn't even this just a convenient way, like a story I'm writing now, so that I can deal with the reality of who my son was. And this is pretty much the last thing we hear him think. And then we find out later on that he killed himself. So it's a really, really dark ending for Stephen, obviously.
So interesting. Although I will say, as far as that narrative, we know something really bad happened between him and Sasha. But
right.
Yes, exactly. It still works. I'm just noting.
Yeah, we never know about that. Yeah. But I mean, Stephen even calls that out. Like when he's writing this narrative about how his son, in a way, maybe even allowed himself to drown at that moment because he gets to go out as a hero, always remembered as a hero, instead of the horrible thing he did the night before when he actually took things too far. And in his mind, he says that's the first time it happens. But then within minutes, he contradicts himself and he says, I don't even know if that's the first time he did this.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know what happened with Sasha. This is all laid out in this internal monologue. He goes, I don't think that he raped her. I think in that case, like the family would have been here. They would have been much more aggressive. Yeah. But whatever he did, it was maybe just a step in that direction.
Yeah.
But he hopes that this is the only time that it ever happened. But he can't even be sure of that, right? He can't even be sure of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so everyone is a victim at the end of this, including Stephen, who kills himself when he at least had this positive memory of his wife, this positive memory of his son as a hero, and all of that is gone now. And going to the idea of what you said before of like especially the opinion, even more so in the series, that all of this should have come out earlier. They would have had time. The family would have had time to reconcile that the son did do something positive, but maybe had this darkness within him as well. And they maybe could have moved past it, but not now. There's nothing left.
Yeah.
Think about what he's done. He's like ruined this woman's life, who victimized her again. He literally says that. Yes. I victimized her again. All right. One more thing I wanted to bring up. I ignored this intentionally earlier when I was talking about the book in the very, I guess, 2 episodes ago, when I first started talking about the comparison to the book. I said there's a big detail in the book that I think is a red herring. It'll either be a red herring or matter in a big way, but I think it's just a red herring. And indeed it was. So when they start investigating Stephen, when she tells her coworker to investigate him, she says, oh, it turns out he had lost his job, and also he'd been arrested for stalking this young man. And there's all these clues, like he starts looking up this kid on Facebook when he creates the Facebook account, and they're like say, ooh, maybe he was a pedophile. Maybe that's the direction the story's going to go in, right? And I never believed that for a second, because they're talking about the age of the boy. And basically his fixation with this guy, with this kid, begins when he reaches the age of his son, when his son died. And they kind of drop it. We never hear his point of view about it. We only hear their investigation side of it. But at the very end of the book, he circles back to it. And he says, there was a time when he had been obsessed with this young man. And in his mind, he was the son he always wanted, that they had had a really good relationship when he was his teacher. He got obsessed with him when he went off to college. And he goes, he felt like his actual son, that his son had never really felt like his son to him, always felt that Jonathan was really smart, but everything came easy to him and he never worked for it. And when other people weren't as good at something as he was, that he naturally was good at, he like disparaged them. And this kid had been poor and had gotten into this elite school by working really hard, and had gotten to university, and he always appreciated him as a student, and they're both ways. And then he had taken it too far, become like fixated on this kid. He had pretended he was going to work and showing up at his college, and things had eventually got arrested, right? So anyway, you can imagine that's a very big detail early on in the book. Unlike the series, it makes Stephen a little more unreliable as a narrator. Anyway, I had excised that because I'm like, well, they're excluding it for some reason. I assumed it was a red herring, and indeed it was. But they do, just to bring that up, they do sew that together at the end, because he does have this reflection of his son versus this other kid, and this, like, even in his own mind, an idealized version of a young man about the same age that he fixates on once his son dies. It literally happens immediately after his son dies. And so I always was like, well, that's where the fixation comes from. He lost his son. Of course he needs
right.
But it is an interesting psychological detail, which they make explicit at the end of the book, and just adds to the tragedy of Stephen's perspective. Yeah. And that's where we end things. Very dark for Stephen, but we do have that really sweet reconciliation. And one last thing, in both cases, the last dialogue from Nicholas is the same, where she basically is telling him everything that happened, and he just says, I don't remember any of that. So in both cases, he does not remember explicitly what happened, or the what he might have witnessed, But we assume, I think the assumption in both cases is that he has internalized it in some way, and that has something to do with the bad relationship he's had with his mom until now. And hopefully this is healing there at the end of the book and the show. So that's about it. Do you have any other last thoughts?
Overall, I am conflicted because I really think the last episode of this was amazing, but the story construction was a little bit off to me. I didn't understand, as we've discussed, some of the decisions about using the other actress. I don't understand how Jonathan's mother could have written with such accuracy about what happened on the day that he drowned. There are just things that bother me, and I am still unsure whether the amazingness of the last episode cancels that out or not.
All those details that you said that are distractions don't add to the thematics of the book or of the series as well. Like, for example, I had speculated last week that maybe there was a diary as well among his. That's not in the book or in the series. Although I guess they're hinting at something maybe in the book, I would say that he had disposed of all her things when he published the book. And he was basically taking credit for writing it. When he makes that revelation about Catherine and looking at the photographs, he's like, I wish I had kept her notes, so maybe there was additional materials that she was using there, but none of this is, I think, very intentionally. It's even the origins of the book to some extent are a little bit unknowable because the people who wrote the book and contributed to this interpretation of it are both dead, right? So I think that's all part of, who knows how this thing actually was made. Yeah, and there's even, I think in the book itself, there is, from Catherine's point of view, there's this question on her part as to, he says he didn't write this book, that his wife wrote it, but she doesn't even know if that's true. We know it's true because we've been in his head, but it just speaks to the fact that whatever story she's writing now in her head is still only based on partial facts, right? So, as is everything in this series.
Well, I mean, and in life, in defense,
and in
right?
Life,
like,
of course.
Yeah, we're always just going from our perspective, and we've talked about it so many times, and I reference the affair every single time. I'm sure everyone has had that experience. If you talk with somebody about an event that you both were there for and experienced together, but your recollection of it is completely different, right? We're the main character in our own lives, and so we kind of have to guess at the rest.
And where our recollections of things are rewritten every time we remember them, first of all. So every time you remember something, you're slightly rewriting it. But not only that, whatever thumbnail sketch of the evening that you decide to write in your little internal diary, which is your brain, and you're connecting dots. So like to your point, you see a fight happen between two people in your recollection of it. And in the story you tell the next day, you're like, this person fought this person for this reason. And then 10 years later, you find out, oh, that wasn't the reason. And you're like, I'm pretty sure someone told me that. And you're like, did they? Or did you just assume that?
Right.
And that now you made it a fact in your mind, like you saw it. Did you see it? That was 10 years ago. I don't know if you saw anything at all. So that's the nature of reality. So don't prejudge too much, people.
That's right.
Yeah. And that brings us to the end of the show. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'll be watching Heretic and discussing it. I'll be discussing the finale of Penguin. I will be watching Day of the Jackal on Peacock. Sona and I will be discussing Based on a True Story season 2, probably in 2 weeks, I think is when that premieres. And then we will decide what other things we might be covering. The following week, as I mentioned, The Agency, if you're curious to check that out, Sona, we could sample that. It'll be available the week of Thanksgiving. So that will be a good time to catch up on all these things that I can't possibly be all watching at the same time. And then in December, more things to watch there. We have, all the best films are going to come out quality-wise towards the end for Academy Award consideration. And a lot of things that were big this year will be available on streaming. And the Dexter prequel will be available. Oh, and I have a recommendation for anybody out there who is hearing our podcast for the first time. We have new listeners just because of this show. So for anybody who's new to the podcast listening, I would say you should listen to our coverage of The White Lotus, which I think is a better show, but thematically has a lot of interesting themes of marriage and reality and perspectives on reality and the narratives we tell ourselves and parenting. All this is in White Lotus, which I think in a much more lighthearted way, let's say. But all these themes are covered there. And I think that is an excellent show. And we will absolutely be covering that season 3, Sona, which is coming in February, I think. So not that far away. Anything else
Cool.
you would recommend to the audience if they've enjoyed our disclaimer conversation?
You know what I really loved, and I was just thinking about this show the other day, and maybe we were alone in loving it. I think you did as well. Is Fleischman is in Trouble?
Oh, yes. Love that. Yes. Good one.
I thought that was amazing.
So check that out too. It's
And
in
I
our
really
feed.
enjoyed talking about it to connect it to the podcast.
Yeah,
I think it's a fantastic show, and it also raised a lot of great issues about parenting and relationships.
absolutely. Yeah, I agree. That's another good one, I think, and probably not as popular as some of our other ones. I think we were covering that at around the same time we covered the White Lotus. So, Sona, we were just fire at that point. All right, Sona, thanks for the conversation, and we'll touch base soon.
Great. Take care.